A werewolf romance story by the Alpha's Claim Collection. Prologue. What would you do if the moment you discovered you were carrying new life was the same moment yours was declared worthless? Not in private. Not in a quiet room where cruelty at least has the decency to whisper. But in front of every person whose respect you had spent years earning. In front of the pack that called you family. In front of the man whose mark you still wore on your skin. What would you do? Would you scream? Would you collapse? Would you beg him to take it back, to look at you the way he used to remember who you were to each other before politics and power and old money decided your value? Or would you go still? Would you set down your glass, lift your chin, and let the cold night air carry every unshed tear away before anyone could witness it? They say a wolf never abandons his mate. They say pack blood runs thicker than ambition. They say an alpha is defined by what he protects. But no one tells you what happens when the alpha decides protection is too expensive. When the mate bond becomes inconvenient. When the woman he marked, the woman carrying his child, becomes a liability he cannot afford in the ledger of power. No one prepares you for that. Tonight, in the shadow of old money and older secrets, inside a mansion where loyalty is currency and silence is survival, you are about to hear the story of a woman who was told she was nothing, who was quietly carrying everything, who walked out of a gilded hall with a broken bond and an unborn heartbeat and rebuilt herself into something this world had not seen in 3 centuries. Her name is Seraphina Cross. She is 8 weeks pregnant. She has just been publicly rejected, and she has absolutely no idea yet what she is. This is her story. And it begins the way all the most dangerous ones do, not with a roar, with a silence. Before we dive into today's story, I have to ask, where in the world are you listening from right now? Drop your location and the time in the comments below. Is it early morning in Melbourne? A quiet afternoon somewhere in Canada? Evening in London? Late night in New York or Dubai? I genuinely love seeing just how far this community reaches across the globe. It never gets old. Now, today's story. This is the story of Seraphina Cross, a woman who stood in a gilded hall carrying the most precious secret of her life, 8 weeks pregnant with her alpha's heir, ready to tell him everything, and watched him choose another woman in front of their entire pack instead. Publicly. Formally. Without hesitation. But what Caden Cresthaven didn't know, what the Northern Alliance didn't know, what nobody in that chandelier-lit ballroom could have predicted, was that the woman they had just discarded was carrying something far more powerful than his child. Something ancient. Something that had been sleeping in her blood for 3 generations, waiting for exactly this kind of betrayal to wake it up. This is a story of public humiliation that becomes private power. Of a rejected mate who was hunted, threatened, and written off, and rose anyway. Of a bond that no council engineered and no paperwork could touch. If you are ready for betrayal, awakening, slow burn tension, and a female lead who is never as powerless as they needed her to be, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story on the Alpha's Claim channel. And don't forget, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Let's see just how wide our paranormal romance family really stretches. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Rejection. The grand hall of Cresthaven Manor had never looked more beautiful, and Seraphina had never felt more out of place inside it. Chandeliers threw gold light across 200 assembled wolves, all dressed in the careful, expensive way that old pack money demanded. Crystal caught the glow and scattered it like stars across the stone ceiling. Somewhere near the entrance, a string quartet played something classical and forgettable. The air smelled of cedarwood, aged wine, and dominance, layered, heavy, the particular scent of a room full of wolves pretending to be civilized. Seraphina stood near the far edge of the crowd, a champagne flute held loosely in her right hand, her left pressed flat against her stomach in a gesture so subtle no one around her would have noticed. 8 weeks. She had found out 4 days ago. 4 days of sitting with it alone, turning it over in her mind like something precious and fragile, rehearsing the moment she would tell him. She had planned it for tonight, after the formal address, after the ceremony. She would find him in the quiet afterward, pull him away from the politics and the performance, and she would say, "Caden, we're going to have a child." She had imagined his face 100 times. Shock first, then that slow, rare smile that he only ever gave her in private. She pressed her hand a little flatter against her stomach. Soon, she told herself. At the front of the hall, the crowd shifted and parted with the particular instinct packs had around their alpha. Caden Cresthaven moved through the room like gravity, tall, dark-suited, composed in the way that power made men when they had never once doubted their right to occupy space. His eyes swept the room as he took the raised platform, and for one brief moment they found hers across the crowd. She smiled. He looked away. Something small and cold moved through her chest, but she dismissed it. He was working. He was always working at events like this. She understood that. The room quieted as he raised one hand. 2 years ago, Caden began, his voice carrying the low, resonant authority of a born alpha. I made a commitment to this pack. Not just to lead, but to build. To strengthen every alliance that keeps Cresthaven standing in an era where old bloodlines are being absorbed and erased by political consolidation. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Tonight, I honor that commitment. Seraphina watched him from her place at the edge. Something about his posture was different. Straighter than usual. Sealed. The Northern Alliance has extended a formal offer of partnership, the kind that will secure Cresthaven's council seat for the next generation and beyond. He paused. I have accepted. Applause broke out. Seraphina clapped with the rest of them. Partnership arrangements were common. This wasn't unusual. She waited for him to continue, for whatever came next. As part of this alliance, Caden said, and his voice shifted, just slightly, just enough that her wolf caught it before her mind did, I will be formalizing a new bond. The applause faded. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick, knowing. The kind of silence that meant everyone else in the room already understood something she did not. I present, Caden said, his gaze moving smoothly to his right, Isolde Vane. Daughter of the Northern Alliance's sovereign bloodline. My chosen Luna. A woman stepped forward. Ivory dress. Dark hair. Beautiful in the carved, deliberate way of someone who had been prepared for this moment their entire life. She took her place at Caden's side with the ease of someone stepping into a space that had always been measured for her. Seraphina did not move. The applause returned, louder now, celebratory, washing over the room like a tide. People around her smiled and raised their glasses. Someone near her shoulder said something about alliances and futures, and she heard none of it. Her wolf had gone completely silent inside her chest. Not in grief. In shock so deep it had temporarily suspended everything, sound, sensation, the ability to process what she had just witnessed in front of 200 witnesses. She needed air. She needed to think. She took one careful step backward, and then another, navigating through the crowd with the mechanical precision of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will. She smiled at the face that turned toward her. She nodded at something someone said. She did not know what. She set her champagne glass down on a passing tray as she reached the edge of the crowd. She set it down perfectly. Not too hard. Not with shaking hands. Perfectly, quietly, without a sound. And that careful, deliberate steadiness was the most devastating thing in the room. She walked out. Behind her, the hall continued to celebrate. Glasses clinked. The quartet played something warmer now, something that sounded like beginnings. Caden Cresthaven accepted congratulations from a line of alphas who pumped his hand and called him strategic and wise. Outside, the night air hit her like cold water. The grounds of Cresthaven Manor stretched ahead, manicured lawns, iron fencing, the distant sound of the city beyond the gates. She walked until the noise of the hall became a murmur, and then almost nothing. She stopped on the stone path near the eastern gate and pressed both palms to her stomach. 8 weeks. Her wolf stirred, wounded, but not broken. Quiet, but still present. And beneath the pain, beneath the shock and the humiliation and the grief of watching 2 years collapse in 40 seconds of polished speech, something else stirred too. Smaller. Warmer. a pulse that was not hers alone. She was still standing like that when footsteps approached from the gate. A man she did not recognize. Dark coat, unhurried bearing. He stopped a careful distance away, respectful of her space in the way that people with real confidence never needed to crowd. "Miss Cross," he said. She looked at him. "My employer has been expecting you." The iron gate behind him swung open silently. A black car idled on the road beyond. And somewhere inside the hall at her back, the man she had loved for 2 years raised a glass with his new Luna and let the crowd witness what came next. Seraphina looked at the car, then at the stranger. Then, without a single word, she walked through the gate. Chapter 2. The Stranger's Offer. She did not ask where they were going. That should have frightened her. She knew. Getting into a car with a stranger who spoke her name like he'd been rehearsing it. Riding through rain-slicked mountain roads in silence while the city lights fell away behind them. It should have triggered every survival instinct a wolf possessed. Instead, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the rain streak sideways across the window and felt something close to calm. Or perhaps it was simply the numbness that follows catastrophic things before grief has the courtesy to arrive properly. The man across from her, he had introduced himself as Elias, did not push conversation. He sat with the relaxed stillness of someone who had learned patience from necessity, not temperament. He was younger than she had first assumed. Early 30s. Dark eyes that observed without invading. After 20 minutes, she spoke first. "Who is your employer?" "Someone who has been watching what happens to Cresthaven Pack with considerable concern," Elias said. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him directly. "Then give me one." Elias studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not calculation, reassessment. "My employer believes you are in danger," he said. "Not from the rejection. From what comes after it." "The Northern Alliance," she said flatly. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. "The rejection wasn't Caden's idea," Elias said quietly. She felt her jaw tighten. The Northern Alliance applied pressure 18 months ago. Cresthaven's council seat was leveraged. Caden was given a structured choice: formalize the alliance through the Vane bond, or lose Cresthaven's political standing permanently. She said nothing. "He resisted for over a year," Elias continued. "Not as comfort, as fact. He chose a council seat," she said. "Yes." The rain intensified against the glass. In the distance, lightning illuminated a mountain ridge, dark stone, old tree lines, a horizon that looked like the edge of the known world. "You said I'm in danger," she said. "From what, specifically?" Elias folded his hands carefully. "The Northern Alliance identified your bloodline 6 years ago. You were flagged as a person of interest before you ever met Caden Cresthaven." The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the night air. "They arranged the introduction," he said. "Between you and Caden. It wasn't coincidence." She absorbed that slowly, carefully. The way you absorb things that restructure everything you believed about your own history. "Why?" she asked. "If they wanted me monitored, controlled, why push Caden to reject me now?" Elias met her gaze steadily. "Because you didn't manifest on their timeline. They expected certain abilities to surface within the first year of a mate bond. When they didn't, the Alliance downgraded your risk assessment and ordered the severance." A pause. "They believe you are a low-value variable." "They're wrong," she said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her. Her wolf stirred beneath her ribs, quietly agreeing. Elias studied her carefully. "Yes," he said. "They are." She looked back at the window. The rain. The dark road ahead. Then she said, very quietly, "He knew about the pregnancy." It was not a question. Something in her had known it since the moment she walked out of that hall. Elias didn't rush to answer. That pause told her everything. "He had you tested 3 weeks ago," he said finally. "Without your knowledge." A routine blood panel arranged through Cresthaven's pack physician. Another pause. He saw the results before he made his decision. The silence in the car became absolute. She didn't cry. Her eyes did not even gloss. She simply sat with that truth and let it settle into the architecture of who Caden Cresthaven actually was, as opposed to who she had spent 2 years believing him to be. The car slowed. Through the rain-blurred glass, an estate emerged from the mountainside, not the manicured grandeur of Cresthaven Manor, but something older, carved from stone and cliff face, lit from within by warm light that had no business being welcoming given the circumstances. Elias stepped out first and opened her door. The mountain air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and rain and something older than both. She stepped out and felt it immediately. A presence. Inside the estate behind those lit windows. Large. Grounded. Powerful in the way of things that have existed long enough to stop needing to prove it. Her wolf, silent since the rejection, hurt and retreated and still, lifted its head. For the first time in hours, it did not whimper. It listened. "You'll be safe here," Elias said. She wasn't certain she believed him, but her wolf did. And right now, that was the only thing in her world that hadn't lied to her tonight. She walked toward the doors. Chapter 3. The Man in the Shadows. The interior of the estate was not what she expected. No display of wealth. No portraits of bloodlines or framed lineage maps or the particular self-congratulation of old pack money. Just stone walls, high ceilings, bookshelves that looked used rather than decorative, and firelight that moved warmly across all of it. It felt, absurdly, like somewhere a person could breathe. Seraphina stood in the entrance hall and listened to the house. It was occupied. She could sense pack presence, several wolves, distributed through the structure with the quiet organization of people who knew their roles without being directed. No tension. No performance. Just function. "He'll come to you," Elias said from behind her. "He doesn't announce himself." Reassuring, she said. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps. She never heard footsteps. Simply a shift in the air pressure of the room, the particular atmospheric change that came with significant alpha presence moving through a space. Then he appeared from the corridor to her left. Tall. Dark coat, sleeves pushed to the forearms. Dark eyes that were nothing like Caden's. Where Caden's alpha gaze was sharp with the awareness of being observed, this man's eyes were simply direct. Like something that had stopped performing composure a very long time ago because it had no use for the performance. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at her for one long, assessing moment. Then he walked past her toward a side table where a kettle sat warming, poured something into a ceramic mug, and set it down on the low table near the fire. "Sit," he said. Not unkind. Not a command. Simply an offer wearing efficient clothing. She sat because her legs were, in honesty, beginning to register the events of the evening. He settled into the chair across from her. The firelight moved across his face. He said nothing. And somehow the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of someone who didn't fill space with sound out of social obligation. She picked up the mug. Tea. She hadn't eaten since that morning. The warmth moved through her hands and she hated, privately, how much she needed it. "You're Raziel Vorn," she said. Something shifted faintly at the corner of his jaw. "Elias talks." Elias confirmed, she corrected. "I assumed." He studied her. "You're steadier than I expected." "I'm furious," she said simply. Steady and furious look identical from the outside. A pause. And then, she would not have believed it if she hadn't seen it. Something moved at the very edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one, acknowledged, and then withdrawn. "You want answers," he said. "I want truth," she corrected again. "They're not always the same thing." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Caden Cresthaven signed legal documentation 2 weeks ago," he said. "Direct, no softening. Surrendering all parental claim to any offspring resulting from your union. It was witnessed by 2 council members and filed with Northern Alliance legal offices." The mug in her hands was warm. She focused on that. "Before the public rejection," she said. "Yes. He erased my child before he erased me." Raziel didn't flinch from the weight of that. He simply held her gaze and let her have the truth without trying to adjust it for her comfort. She respected that more than she could have articulated. Your bloodline, he said after a moment. How much do you know about your mother's line? She looked at him. She died when I was 11. She didn't speak about family history. Did she ever speak about abilities? Gifts. Things she asked you to keep private. Something moved in her chest. A memory. Her mother's hands, warm around hers. The particular way she had said, "If they ever come for you, don't run, Sarah. Shine." She said things I didn't understand. Seraphina said quietly. I thought it was grief talking. She was ill for a long time before she died. Raziel was quiet for a moment. Then, your mother's bloodline carries a dormant genetic marker. It surfaces differently in every generation. Sometimes as heightened instinct. Sometimes as something considerably more significant. His eyes moved briefly to her hands. The Northern Alliance has been hunting this marker for 3 generations. Identifying carriers. Neutralizing them before activation. Neutralizing. The word sat in the room like something with weight. They think I'm dormant, she said slowly. They decided you were, Raziel replied. 6 weeks ago. Which is why they authorized the severance. A pause. They were wrong. She set the mug down carefully. How do you know? He looked at her hands again. She looked down. On the inside of her left wrist, the mark she had noticed 4 mornings ago, the day after the rejection, the small golden inscription she had attributed to stress or sleep deprivation, it was glowing. Faint. Steady. Like an ember that had been waiting for someone to acknowledge it. She had thought it was a stress response. A bruise from the emotional violence of rejection on a mate bond. It wasn't. Her pulse quickened. Her wolf stirred, fully awake now, not in fear, in the slow, enormous recognition of something remembering itself. What is this? She asked quietly. Before Raziel could answer, the door at the far end of the corridor burst open. Elias, moving fast. Cresthaven enforcers, he said. 20 minutes out. 3 vehicles. Raziel rose from his chair. Not with urgency. With the particular unhurried efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment for considerably longer than 20 minutes. His eyes moved to Seraphina. Something moved behind them. Not quite the shadow of a smile this time. Something older. Something that looked, in the firelight, almost like recognition. Let them come, he said quietly. And somewhere in the core of her chest, where her wolf had been silent and wounded all evening, something ancient and luminous opened one eye. Chapter 4. What she doesn't know about herself. 20 minutes. Seraphina used every second of them. While Raziel moved through the estate issuing quiet instructions to his pack, she found herself drawn down a corridor she hadn't been shown, lined with shelves, narrow, lit by overhead light that hummed softly above packed rows of leather spines and archival boxes. Not a decorative library. A working one. The kind of room that smelled of paper and use, and the particular dust of information that mattered too much to discard. She ran her fingers along the shelf edges until she found them. Bloodline records. Hybrid lineage. Dormant markers. She pulled the relevant volume without hesitation, her hands finding it with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic. As if some part of her already knew exactly where to look. She turned pages quickly. Names and dates and notations in cramped, careful handwriting spanning decades. Most entries were clinical. Carrier identified. Marker suppressed. Subject relocated. She tried not to think about what relocated meant in this context. Then her fingers stopped. Marin Cross, daughter of Alara Cross, human lineage, and Thomas Vale, dormant carrier. Status. Awakened, partial. Marker activation recorded. Suspended following severe emotional trauma. Notes. Subject chose suppression. Gifted pass to offspring. Marin Cross. Her mother. Seraphina's breath moved out of her lungs slowly, carefully. The way breath moves when the body is managing something the mind hasn't fully processed yet. Her mother had known. Had carried this. Had chosen, for reasons Seraphina could not yet fathom, to suppress it. And in doing so, had passed it forward. Undiluted. Waiting. Gifted pass to offspring. She turned the page. A second entry. Newer handwriting. Dated 6 years ago, Around the time Elias had said the Northern Alliance first flagged her. Seraphina Cross. Second-generation carrier. Marker unactivated as of assessment date. Trigger. Significant mate bond severance, or emotional trauma of sufficient magnitude combined with protective instinct. She read that last line again. Protective instinct. Her hand moved to her stomach without conscious thought. 8 weeks. A heartbeat that was not hers. A life she had already, in 4 days of quiet secret-keeping, built a fortress around inside her chest. The mark on her wrist flared. Not faintly this time. Bright, sustained, a golden luminescence that threw warm light across the page in her hands. She felt it move up her forearm like warmth through water. Not painful, the opposite of painful, like something that had been held at pressure for years suddenly finding the space it needed. Her wolf rose inside her fully. Not the wounded, retreated creature of the last several hours. Something older. Something that had been waiting beneath the grief, with remarkable patience. And then a pulse. Low and warm and startlingly strong, moving through her abdomen from the inside. Not her heartbeat. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. Her breath caught. Her child had responded. 8 weeks. Barely formed. And already, reacting to her power as it moved through her blood. As if recognizing it. As if saying, without language, without anything but pure biological certainty, I know this. I carry this too. Her eyes filled. Just briefly. Just once. She let them. Footsteps in the corridor. Quick, deliberate. Elias appeared in the doorway. His face was doing something it hadn't done since she'd met him. It was pale. They're not sending more enforcers, he said. His voice was careful in the way voices get when the information they're carrying is genuinely dangerous. The Northern Alliance has authorized a different response. A beat. They're sending hunters. The warmth on her wrist steadied. Her wolf did not flinch. And from somewhere deeper in the estate, she heard Raziel's voice, low, unhurried, already giving instructions. Good, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her. Let them come and find out what they missed. Chapter 5. The Enforcer at the Door. The Cresthaven enforcers arrived first. 3 vehicles. 6 wolves in total, dressed in the formal dark of official pack business, moving with the coordinated efficiency of men who had delivered difficult messages before and expected, based on prior experience, to encounter no meaningful resistance. They had not, Seraphina suspected, accounted for tonight specifically. She was already at the front door when Elias reached her. You don't have to be the one who... Yes, she said quietly. I do. Raziel appeared at the end of the entrance hall. He did not move to stop her. He simply stood, arms relaxed, watching, with the particular stillness of a man who had decided to let something play out and was entirely prepared for every possible version of what came next. She opened the door herself. The lead enforcer was broad, mid-40s, with the flat expression of someone who processed people as variables rather than individuals. He looked at her the way men in his position often looked at women in hers, with the efficient dismissal of someone whose paperwork had already been completed and who merely required a signature. Seraphina Cross, he said. Formal. Practiced. Yes, she said. By order of Alpha Caden Cresthaven, and in accordance with formal rejection protocol, you are required to appear before the Cresthaven Pact Council to complete the official dissolution of... No. He stopped. The word had not been loud. She hadn't raised her voice or pressed forward into a space or performed any of the aggressive assertion that dominance challenges typically required. She had simply said no, clearly and without decoration, in the tone of someone stating a fact about the physical world. The enforcer blinked. Miss Cross, this is not a request. Official rejection protocol requires. I heard you. She looked at him steadily. I will appear before the council. When I'm ready. On my terms. He laughed. Not cruelly, with genuine amusement. The kind that came from a man who had never once encountered a rejected mate who understood she had options. You don't have terms, he said. You have. The mark on her wrist blazed. No build-up. No warning. Gold light, sudden and absolute, flaring from beneath her sleeve and flooding the doorway with warm luminescence. It moved outward from her skin like heat from an open flame, not attacking, not aggressive, simply present with a completeness that was somehow more commanding than aggression. The lead enforcer stepped back. One step. Involuntary. His body making a decision his pride had not authorized. Behind him, two of the other wolves shifted their weight. One of them, younger, positioned furthest back, dropped his gaze instinctively. Not submission. Something closer to awe. The lead enforcer recovered quickly.
His jaw tightened.
His eyes hardened back into professionalism. But the step back had happened, and every wolf present had witnessed it, and in the language of wolves, that moment had said everything the paperwork couldn't. "We'll be in contact," he said finally. The formality was intact. The authority was not. "I look forward to it," Seraphina said. She closed the door. Behind her, the entrance hall was very quiet. She stood with her back to the room for exactly 3 seconds, her hand against the wood of the door, letting her breathing settle. Then she turned. Raziel was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not surprise. She had the distinct impression very few things surprised him. Something more considered than that. Something that lived in the vicinity of reassessment. He didn't say, "Well done." He didn't perform approval. He simply looked at her with those direct, unhurried eyes and gave her a single nod that communicated more than a speech would have. Then Elias's phone rang. He answered, listened for approximately 4 seconds, and when he lowered the phone, the color that had returned to his face since the enforcers arrived had gone again. "The hunters aren't tracking from Cresthaven territory," he said quietly. "They've already crossed the mountain boundary." A pause. "They've been moving since before the enforcers left. They were already coming before the rejection was even announced." The room absorbed that. They had planned this before tonight. The rejection had not triggered the hunt. The rejection had simply been the signal that the hunt could begin. Seraphina's wolf did not tremble. It began to calculate. Chapter 6. The truth about Caden. The mountain wind had teeth after midnight. Seraphina stood at the edge of the cliff terrace, arms folded against the cold, watching the valley below where the lights of distant civilization blinked with the particular indifference of a world that had no idea what moved through its shadow. The tea had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't slept. She wasn't going to. She heard him before he appeared. That same atmospheric shift, pressure changing in the way of significant things moving through space. Raziel settled beside her at the stone railing. Not close enough to crowd. Close enough to be present. They stood in silence for a while. She was beginning to understand simply how he existed in the world. He didn't fill quiet with noise. He let it be what it was. She spoke first. Was any of it real? She wasn't certain why she asked him. He hadn't known Caden. He had no personal access to the architecture of her marriage. But there was something about the way he engaged with truth, directly, without editorial, without the kindness that softened things into lies, that made her want the answer from him rather than from anyone who might try to protect her from it. He considered the question properly. She appreciated that he didn't rush to comfort. "Some of it," he said finally. She looked at him. "The Northern Alliance identified your bloodline marker 6 years ago," he said. "They needed you bonded to a controllable alpha, someone with enough standing to keep you inside pack infrastructure where you could be monitored, but not enough independence to resist council pressure when it arrived." A pause. "They selected Caden Cresthaven. They arranged the circumstances of your introduction." She had known this since the car. It still landed differently the second time. "He didn't know at first," Raziel continued. "He was maneuvered, the same way you were. The difference is he found out. Approximately 18 months into your marriage." Her jaw tightened. "And he said nothing." He pushed back initially. Refused several directives. The alliance applied increasing pressure, council seat, territory recognition, financial leverage. He spent a year resisting. Raziel's voice was even, not cold. Simply factual. Then he stopped. He chose the seat. "Yes." She turned back to the valley. Wind moved through her hair. Below, Something, an animal, something ordinary and unhurried, moved through the tree line and disappeared. "The bond," she said quietly. "He marked me. That wasn't arranged. They can't engineer that." "No," Raziel agreed. "They can't." A pause. "The mate bond that formed between you is real. The alliance didn't plan for it. It complicated their timeline considerably." She absorbed that. Let it exist beside everything else.
"So he loved me," she said.
Not a question. Testing the shape of it. Raziel was quiet for a moment. "I think he did. In the way that men who have learned to treat everything as currency eventually learn to love, with part of themselves kept permanently in reserve, in case the cost changes." The accuracy of it was devastating. She had felt that reserve in him for years and named it introversion, named it leadership pressure, named it anything except what it actually was, a man who loved her while keeping one hand on the exit. He knew about the pregnancy, she said. He saw those results and still stood up there and, yes. The word was not gentle. It was simply true. And she needed it to be true without softening, because softened truths were how she had spent 2 years explaining away things she should have looked at directly. "He hesitated for 2 years, she said finally, and then chose a council seat." Raziel said nothing. There was nothing to add. She straightened against the railing. The cold had moved through her coat entirely now, but she barely felt it. Something warmer was moving through her from the inside. Not anger. Not yet. Something more purposeful than anger. Something that would outlast anger considerably. She became aware, slowly, of something else.
A pull.
Quiet and strange, and nothing like the mate bond she had worn for 2 years, that had always felt like being tethered, being accounted for, being located. This was different. This felt like standing next to something that produced its own gravity. Something that wasn't pulling her toward it so much as making her aware, for the first time, of her own weight. She looked sideways at Raziel. He was looking at the valley, but his jaw had shifted, that almost imperceptible tightening she was beginning to recognize as his version of significant internal experience. He had felt it too. Her wolf lifted its head inside her chest. Not in longing, in the slow, enormous recognition of something that required no explanation because it existed below the level of language entirely. She looked away quickly. "You should sleep," Raziel said. His voice was slightly different, not the careful neutrality of earlier. Something underneath it that he was, with considerable discipline, keeping from the surface. "The hunters are 20 minutes from the boundary line," she said. "I know. You're telling me to sleep anyway." "I'm telling you to rest," he said. "There's a difference. Rest means you'll be at full capacity when it matters. And it will matter soon enough." She pushed off the railing, turned toward the door.
Stopped.
"Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not for the first time, but differently than before. Not suspicious. Genuinely needing to understand. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because your father's bloodline and mine share a history," he said finally. "Because the Northern Alliance has been hunting first marker carriers for 3 generations, and I have been building toward the moment someone gave them a reason to stop."
He paused.
"And because you walked out of that hall tonight without breaking a single thing, and that kind of strength deserves to be protected until it learns to protect itself." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "It's already learning," she said quietly. She heard. She was almost certain she heard. The very faint sound of something that could, under different circumstances, have become a smile. She went inside. Chapter 7. The hunters arrive. She didn't sleep. She lay on the bed in the room they had given her, sparse, warm, a window that faced east, and listened to the estate breathe around her. Pack movement below, organized and quiet. Raziel's voice once, briefly, giving instruction she couldn't make out through the floor. Then silence that wasn't empty. Alert silence. The silence of a house preparing for something. She felt it when they crossed the boundary. Not through sound or sight. Through her wolf. A pressure against the edge of her awareness, like something wrong moving through territory that had its own immune response. Her wolf was on its feet inside her before she was. She was dressed and in the corridor in under a minute. The estate responded with quiet, immediate precision. Raziel's pack was not the kind that ran toward noise. They moved into position the way trained bodies moved, with the economical certainty of people who had rehearsed this in various forms for years. No shouting. No panic. Doors sealed. Positions taken. She found Elias in the main hall. How many? 8 confirmed. Likely 10. He was watching a monitor, security feed, multiple cameras across the estate perimeter. These aren't enforcers. They carry suppressors. Bloodline inhibitors. His jaw was tight. They were designed specifically for first marker carriers. She watched the feed. Dark figures moving through the tree line below the eastern slope.
Fast. Practiced.
Nothing like the formal posturing of the Cresthaven enforcers. These moved like people who came to finish things. Where's Raziel? Eastern perimeter. He went to meet. Elias stopped. Turned. He said you were to stay. She was already moving. She came through the side exit onto the lower terrace just as the first breach happened. 2 hunters had scaled the eastern wall, moving fast, each carrying a device at their hip that emitted a low, mechanical frequency she could feel against her teeth. Suppressor tech, designed to disrupt the connection between wolf and bloodline gift, to cut the power before it could be used. Raziel was already there, and watching him move was, she would think about this later, she told herself, but the honest truth was she had never seen anything like it. He wasn't feral. He wasn't performing. He intercepted the first hunter with absolute economy of motion, controlled, precise, overwhelming, redirecting the attack and removing the threat with the calm efficiency of someone doing something they had done enough times to stop finding remarkable. The second hunter moved around the engagement and broke toward the terrace. Toward her. She saw him coming. Calculated the distance. Her wolf rose. The suppressor at his hip activated, that mechanical frequency intensifying, pressing against her gift like hands trying to smother a flame. She felt it. The push. The deliberate, engineered attempt to cut her off from what lived in her blood. It didn't work, because what lived in her blood was not a switch that could be reached from the outside. It was not a system. It was older than the technology trying to interrupt it, and it recognized the attempt with something that felt, startlingly, like a fence. The mark blazed. Gold light surged outward. Not a pulse this time, not the controlled flicker of the doorway or the corridor. A wave. Clean and bright and absolute. It moved from her in every direction simultaneously with a sound like a chord struck on an enormous instrument. Not loud, resonant. The kind of sound felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. The hunter was thrown backward. Not violently, lifted and deposited, like something the world had simply decided to relocate. He hit the stone wall of the lower terrace and stayed there, stunned, unhurt, entirely unable to explain to himself what had just happened. The suppressor at his hip fizzed. Went dark. The mechanical frequency stopped. Silence. She stood in the center of the terrace, breathing steadily, both hands slightly raised from her sides. Gold light receded slowly back beneath her skin. The mark on her wrist glowed with a warmth that didn't fade this time. It settled. Permanent. Decided. She looked at her own hands. Last week she had been a Pac Luna planning a quiet moment to share a pregnancy test. Tonight, she had just neutralized Northern Alliance suppressor technology with something that had lived unactivated in her blood for 27 years and simply decided, when the moment was sufficient, to wake up. Her wolf sat back on its haunches and regarded her with an expression she could only describe as satisfied. Footsteps. Raziel appeared from the eastern side. He crossed the terrace and stopped 3 feet from her, taking in the unconscious hunter, the dead suppressor, the steady gold warmth still visible at her wrist. His eyes moved to her face. It's accelerating, he said quietly. Not concerned. Observing. Filing the data. I noticed, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Something behind his eyes was doing something complex and deliberate and thoroughly controlled. Then he looked down at her wrist. At the mark. That's not a dormant marker anymore, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. Her phone lit up on the stone railing where she had set it coming outside. She reached for it, looked at the screen. A message. Caden's number. 4 words. Come back. Please.
Now.
The gold light at her wrist pulsed once. She looked at Raziel. He looked at the phone. Then at her. His expression gave her nothing. Deliberately, she was beginning to understand. He was a man who believed in her right to her own conclusions. She looked back at the 4 words. Her wolf was very still. Chapter 8. He wants her back. She called him, not because she wanted to, because she needed to hear his voice do what it was about to do, needed to hear it directly, without intermediary, without anyone else's summary standing between her and the truth of who Caden Cresthaven had decided to be. He answered on the first ring. Sarah. 2 years of that voice saying her name. 2 years of finding safety in its particular register, low, controlled, always measured. She had loved that control once. She had called it strength. You sent hunters, she said. A pause. That wasn't me. The alliance moved independently. I didn't authorize. You signed documents surrendering my child, Caden. Silence. Before the rejection, she continued. Before you stood in front of your entire pack and announced her. She heard him exhale. Which part of that was outside your control? I didn't know about the pregnancy when I signed them. A pause. The tests, I had the physician run a routine panel. I didn't look at the results until after the ceremony. He stopped himself. I didn't know, Sarah. But you know now. Yes. And that's why you're calling. The line was quiet for a beat too long. I'm calling because hunters are in your territory, and I can't protect you from there. His voice shifted, something urgent and genuine beneath the management. If you come back to Cresthaven, I can control the variables. The Alliance has limitations on what they can authorize within active pack. I'm not a variable, she said.
He stopped.
You ran tests on me without my knowledge, she said. Her voice was even. She was distantly amazed by how even it was. You saw the results. You stood in that hall anyway, and you chose, publicly, formally, in front of everyone we knew, to replace me.
A breath.
And now that your choice has consequences you didn't predict, you want me to come back, so you can manage the situation. Sarah, Is it about the child? She asked directly. Are you calling because you want our child safe, or because a rejected mate carrying a first marker heir protected by Raziel Vorn is a political crisis you cannot contain from a distance? The silence that followed was the most honest thing he had said all evening. She heard him exhale slowly. Both, he admitted finally. And she respected that precisely one moment, because it was the first completely truthful thing he had offered her. Both of those things are true. And I know that's not, he stopped. I know what I did. Do you? I chose wrong. Quieter now. Not performance. I chose wrong and I can't undo the public of it, and I can't reach you from here, and I don't. A pause that sounded like a man running out of language for something. I didn't know what you were carrying, Sarah. I mean the child, and I mean the other thing. What's in your blood? I didn't understand what the Alliance was actually afraid of. And now you do. Now I do. She stood by the window of the estate. Below, Raziel's pack was running a perimeter check, quiet, methodical, the aftermath of the hunter breach being processed with characteristic efficiency. The valley lights blinked in the distance. The same stars. A completely different world than 3 hours ago. The child is mine, she said. Not the Council's. Not the Alliance's. Not yours by claim when it's convenient and surrendered when it isn't. Her hand pressed over her stomach. Mine. He didn't argue. And she noted, quietly, what it meant that he didn't argue. The conclave, he said finally. The Council is convening one. 48 hours. If you don't appear, the Northern Alliance can invoke the Emergency Inheritance Clause. It would give them default guardianship claim over any offspring from the dissolved union. Her jaw tightened. They plan that too, she said. Yes. You're warning me.
A pause.
Yes. She looked at her wrist. The mark glowed steadily, patient and warm. Her wolf considered the information the way a general considered a map, Not with fear, with strategy. "Thank you for the warning," she said. "Sarah." She ended the call. She stood in the quiet for a moment. 3 seconds, she allowed herself. The ghost of 2 years. The particular grief of loving someone who kept one hand on the exit the entire time without ever telling you. Then she turned. Raziel was in the doorway. He had not, she realized, heard the call. He had simply known where she would be and come to find her when enough time had passed. Not to manage her. To be present for whatever she needed next. "Conclave," she said. 48 hours. The Alliance has an emergency clause. "I know the clause. They'll invoke it if I don't appear." "Yes." She looked at him squarely. "Then I'll appear." Something moved behind his eyes. "It will accelerate the awakening. Being in that space, that many dominant wolves, the pressure of—" "I know," she said. "Your power could spike beyond what's—" "I know." She held his gaze. "But I also know what happens if I hide in this cliff house waiting for 48 hours while they build a legal architecture around my child." Her mark pulsed. "I'm not hiding." Raziel studied her for a long moment. The firelight from the corridor moved across his face. The expression there was complex in the way of someone who had prepared extensive arguments against a conclusion and was quietly, privately, finding that the conclusion was right. He stepped back from the doorway. "Then we have 48 hours to prepare," he said. She walked past him into the corridor. Their arms nearly touched in the narrow space. The pull, that gravity that had nothing to do with the Alliance or bloodlines or politics, moved through her like a low chord. She kept walking. But her wolf turned its head back toward him and stayed turned for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. Chapter 9. When two alphas meet. He came alone. Seraphina had expected that. Caden Cresthaven had always understood optics with the particular precision of a man raised to perform strength for an audience. Arriving with an escort would have looked like aggression. Arriving alone looked like vulnerability. And carefully constructed vulnerability, in the right setting, was its own kind of power play. She recognized it because she had spent 2 years learning how he thought. The gates of the estate opened at Raziel's instruction, not as welcome, as a decision. There was a difference. Elias stood to the left of the entrance with 2 of Raziel's pack flanking him, relaxed and undemonstrative in the way of people who had nothing to prove by performing threat. Caden stepped out of the car and into the cold mountain air, and for a moment, just one, she let herself see him clearly. Dark coat. That particular set to his jaw that meant he had prepared for this conversation from multiple angles and intended to navigate it with precision. He was still, objectively, the most composed man she had ever known. He was also the man who had signed away her child's existence on a Tuesday afternoon and stood at a podium 3 days later and smiled. She let that sit exactly where it belonged. Raziel stood beside her. Not in front, not behind. Beside. That positioning was its own language, and every wolf present read it instantly. Caden's eyes moved from her face to Raziel and back. Something passed through his expression too quickly to name. "You look different," he said to her. Not an accusation. Observation, with something underneath it that might have been grief, if he had given himself permission for grief. "I am different," she said. He nodded once, accepting that. Then he looked at Raziel directly. "You know what combining your bloodline with hers would trigger." "I'm aware of the variables," Raziel said. "The council won't." "The council," Raziel said, with a quietness that was somehow more final than volume, "does not govern what happens between a true bond and a first marker awakening. They never did. They simply convinced everyone otherwise." Caden's jaw tightened. He looked back at Seraphina. "I came to tell you what I know about the conclave," he said. "Not to negotiate. Not to ask for anything." A pause. "Just to tell you." She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Tell me." "Malvern has already drafted the emergency clause paperwork," he said. "It's prepared. The moment the conclave opens, he'll move to invoke it before you have any opportunity to speak. He's going to try to make this procedural, fast, public, final, before your presence in that space can shift the room." His eyes held hers. "He's afraid of what happens when wolves feel what you carry, Sarah. He's trying to contain it on paper before it can become real in a room. Then I need to be in that room before the paperwork moves, she said. Yes. How much before? An hour. Maybe less. He reached into his coat and held out a folded document. Cresthaven PAC's formal request for conclave review of Northern Alliance emergency clause. Filed this morning. He extended it toward her. It buys you procedural standing. They have to hear you before they can vote. She looked at the document, then at him. Why, she said, not with suspicion. With the genuine, unadorned need to understand why the man who had spent 18 months choosing everything over her had driven alone up a mountain road in the middle of the night with a piece of paper that cost him politically to file. He was quiet for long enough that the mountain wind filled the silence. Because I was afraid, he said finally. For 18 months I was afraid, and I told myself it was strategy, and it wasn't. It was just fear. And then I chose the thing that fear wanted me to choose, and he stopped. She's mine too, he said quietly. The child. Whatever I signed, whatever they filed, that's mine too, and I should have been the one protecting that from the start. The mountain held the silence. Seraphina reached out and took the document. Thank you, she said. 2 words. Careful and final, and carrying the exact weight of what they were. Not forgiveness, not reopening. Acknowledgement of a single right thing done in the aftermath of many wrong ones. Caden nodded. He looked at her one more time with something that had no strategy left in it at all. Then he looked at Raziel. If she goes into that conclave, he said quietly, and the power spikes the way I think it will, you know what it could cost you. Raziel met his gaze. Yes. And you're going anyway. Yes. Caden studied him for a long moment. Wolf to wolf, alpha to alpha. Then he did something she had never once seen him do in 2 years of watching him move through rooms full of powerful men. He dipped his chin. Fractional. Respectful. He got back in the car. The gate closed behind him. Seraphina stood in the cold with the document in her hands and the mark burning warm and steady at her wrist, and Raziel's presence beside her like gravity that had stopped pretending to be accidental. He filed that knowing it would cost him his alliance, she said. Yes, Raziel said. One right thing. It's a beginning, he said simply. She looked down at the document. Then up at the sky, full dark now, stars pressed close over the mountain, the moon not quite full but enormous, hanging low and pale and watching with the patient attention of something ancient. Her wolf lifted its face toward it. Her child moved, that small warm pulse, steady and certain, and entirely unimpressed by councils and clauses and the politics of frightened men. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, Raziel confirmed. She turned toward the doors. His hand brushed hers, barely, briefly, the lightest possible contact in the dark. Not claiming, not asking, just present. Her wolf exhaled and did not look away. Chapter 10. The queen they never saw coming. The conclave grounds were older than the council that used them. Stone circle. Open sky. Ancient oak at the perimeter, roots deeper than anyone alive could account for. This was where PAC law had been spoken before glass towers existed, before council bureaucracy had dressed itself in the language of civilization. This was where truth had been decided by something more honest than paperwork. Tonight, torchlight moved across 200 assembled wolves. Every significant PAC in the territory. Alphas, elders, enforcers, betas. The full architecture of a world that had governed itself through controlled hierarchy for 3 centuries and was about to be asked, for the first time in living memory, to consider a different question. Seraphina walked in alone. No announcement. No escort. No ceremonial entry designed to signal what she needed them to understand before she opened her mouth. She simply walked through the outer perimeter of the stone circle and into the torchlight, and let the room do what rooms full of wolves do when something that carries genuine power enters their space. They felt her. Not the performance of dominance. Not the structured assertion of rank. Something underneath all of that, older, quieter, and considerably more difficult to dismiss because it made no demands. It simply was. Like barometric pressure before a storm. The kind of thing the body registers before the mind has language for it. The murmuring that had filled the grounds on her approach died in sections, each group going quiet as she passed, like lights dimming in sequence across a city. Elder Malvern stood at the central stone, ancient, broad-shouldered, carrying the particular solidity of a man who had sat at the center of power long enough to have confused the seat for the source. He watched her approach with the measured calm of someone who had drafted the paperwork, confirmed the votes, and arrived tonight expecting to preside over a formality. He had a folder open in his hands. She held up the Cresthaven document before he could speak. "Procedural review request," she said clearly. "Filed this morning. Registered." She set it on the stone between them. "You hear me before you vote." The procedural challenge rippled through the assembled wolves. Malvern looked at the document. His expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes recalculated. He had no legal counter, and every wolf present knew it. He stepped back from the stone. The ground was hers. She turned to face them. All of them. Every faction. Every bloodline. Every pair of eyes that had come tonight either hoping she would fail or terrified that she wouldn't. "I was bonded without full consent," she said. "Not accusation.
Fact."
My bloodline was flagged, monitored, and strategically positioned by the Northern Alliance before I was old enough to understand what that meant. When I didn't perform on their timeline, I was discarded. Publicly. Formally. With paperwork drafted in advance. Silence. My child, 8 weeks old, was surrendered by legal document before I was even told about my own pregnancy. The silence deepened into something heavier. "I'm not here to ask for sympathy," she continued. "I'm not here to appeal to tradition or argue bloodline precedent or position myself within a structure that was designed from its foundation to prevent exactly this moment from happening." She looked across the assembled faces. "I'm here because 200 wolves deserve to make a real choice. Not the choice the council prepared for you. Not the choice the Northern Alliance filed paperwork around.
A beat.
A real one." Malvern stepped forward. "The first marker awakening is destabilizing by nature," he said, addressing not her but the crowd. "History documents." "History was written by the council," she said simply. The crowd shifted. "The first bloodline," she continued, "was not documented as dangerous until it began refusing to be controlled. There is a difference between destabilizing and liberating, and the people who benefit from the current structure have spent 3 centuries hoping you wouldn't notice it." She felt it then, the threshold. The line Raziel had named, that Malvern had warned about, that her own body had been approaching for 48 hours with the steady inevitability of a tide. Full awakening. She felt it the way you feel a wave before it breaks. The pull of it, the pressure, the enormous gathered momentum of something that had been building since the night of the rejection, since the archive room, since the cliff terrace, since she had thrown a hunter across a stone terrace with her bare hands and stood looking at her own palms in the dark. She could hold it back. She understood that. She could maintain the careful, controlled version of herself that had kept one hand on restraint from the beginning. She could make this a speech and win it on language and leave the threshold uncrossed. She looked for Raziel. He stood at the outer edge of the circle, among his pack. Not centered. Not performing his presence. Just there, solid, direct, watching her with the same unhurried steadiness she had come to understand was simply how he existed in the world. Not waiting for her to be impressive. Present for her to be true. He gave her nothing. No instruction. No signal. Just that single, steady look that said, "I am here. Whatever you choose. I am here." Her wolf made the decision before she did. She stopped holding back. The mark blazed. Not a flare, an opening. Gold light poured from her wrist and moved up her arm and across her skin like sunrise moving across water, steady and unstoppable and warm. It spread outward from her body in every direction. Not a shock wave, not an attack, a tide. Clean and ancient and entirely without aggression. It simply moved through the space the way truth moves through a room where everyone already knows it, not forcing, illuminating. Every torch in the circle flared bright simultaneously. Wolves began dropping to one knee. Not by force, by instinct. by the recognition of something in their blood that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for this exact frequency. The first marker awakening didn't command them. It reminded them of something older than the council, of something that predated the hierarchy and the paperwork and the carefully structured fear that had kept them in their assigned positions for 3 centuries. Malvern staggered, one step, then caught himself. His dominance surged outward in response, automatic and enormous. It moved toward her like a wave and dissolved at the edge of her light. Not deflected.
Absorbed.
Gently, completely, without drama. He stared at her. The folder slipped from his hands. The gold light reached Raziel at the outer edge of the circle. She felt the moment it touched him. Felt it through the bond that had been building between them since the first night, that had no council fingerprints anywhere on it, that had formed in the space between a cliff terrace and a corridor and a barely there brush of hands in the dark. The light moved into him, and instead of the fracture the elders had predicted, instead of the overwhelming, the consuming, the breaking of a lesser bond beneath a greater one, it synchronized.
His eyes changed.
Not silver, not gold.
Both.
Balanced. The bond didn't break him. It completed. A sound moved through the circle, not a howl, not language. Something between them. The kind of sound 200 wolves make when they recognize, simultaneously, that the world has just reorganized itself around a truth they can't argue with because it lives below argument. Seraphina stood in the center of the light and breathed. It didn't hurt. She had expected it to hurt. The threshold, the full crossing, the weight of what her bloodline had been carrying for 3 generations finally coming to rest in her. Instead, it felt like setting something down. Like the moment after holding your breath for so long your body had forgotten what it felt like, and then remembering. The light settled slowly, not fading, settling, into her skin, into the mark, into the steady warmth of her abdomen where her child pulsed, strong, calm, entirely undisturbed, as if this was simply the natural order of things coming into alignment. She looked at Malvern. He was on one knee, the folder at his feet. His ancient eyes, carrying 3 centuries of council authority, looking up at her with an expression she had not expected. Not rage, not defiance, exhaustion. The first bloodline returns, he said. His voice carried across the silent grounds without effort. Not performance, acknowledgement, but not as conqueror. He looked at her directly. As what, then? She held his gaze. As a beginning, she said simply. New governance. Shared authority. Pacts choose their own leadership. Bloodline no longer determines rights. The council remains, reformed, not removed. Elected, not inherited. She let that settle. And my child is born free. Not as property of any alliance, any clause, any bloodline agenda. The gold warmth at her wrist pulsed once. Free. The silence held for exactly 3 seconds. Then Caden Cresthaven, standing among his faction at the southern edge of the circle, lowered himself fully to one knee. His head bowed.
Publicly.
Formally. The mate bond that had lived between them for 2 years, already frayed and severed at the edges, released its last thread completely in that moment. Not in grief. In honesty. A man acknowledging what he had failed to be, in the only language wolves had for it. One by one, the assembled packs followed. Not all of them. There would be dissent. There would be negotiation. There would be months of building the structure she had just named in a stone circle under torchlight. She understood that. She had no illusions about the difficulty of what came next. But 200 wolves, in the cold mountain air, under a moon so large it felt close enough to touch, looked at a woman who had been publicly discarded 9 weeks pregnant and chose freely to bow their heads. Not to her bloodline.
To her.
Raziel crossed the circle. He came to stand beside her, not above, not behind. Beside. Equal pace, equal presence, as he had been from the moment she walked through his gates with cold hands and a broken bond and something ancient beginning to wake in her blood. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She reached for his hand. The moment their fingers met, the gold light and the balanced warmth of what lived in him moved together. Not merging, harmonizing. Two distinct things making something that was stronger than either alone. Her wolf exhaled so deeply it felt like the first full breath of her life. "It's not finished," she said quietly, not to the crowd but to him. "No," he agreed. "There will be opposition. Legal challenges. The Northern Alliance won't." "No," he agreed again. His hand was steady around hers. Grounding.
Certain.
"But you didn't come here to finish something." She looked at him. "You came here," he said, "to start it." The torches burned. The moon watched. The ancient oaks held their position at the perimeter with the patient indifference of things that have stood through enough history to know when they are witnessing something worth remembering. And in the center of a stone circle older than the council that had used it to contain things it feared, a woman placed her free hand over her stomach and felt her child respond, warm and strong and entirely, completely, unafraid. Epilogue. She had been 8 weeks pregnant when a man she loved decided she wasn't worth the cost. 8 weeks, when she discovered that her entire introduction to the life she'd built had been engineered by people who saw her as a variable to be monitored and discarded when inconvenient. 8 weeks, when the bond she had worn like a promise turned out to be a cage dressed in the language of devotion. They said a rejected mate was diminished, weakened. That severance broke something fundamental in a wolf that could not be recovered. They were wrong. They said a pregnant wolf was vulnerable. That the weight of new life made her a liability rather than a threat. That the council's clauses and the alliance's hunters and the paperwork of powerful men would be sufficient to contain whatever she was becoming. They were wrong about that too. They said the first bloodline was extinct. That 3 generations of hunting and suppression and strategic silencing had closed a chapter of history that the world was better without. You heard what happened when they were wrong about that. Seraphina Cross did not rise because a prophecy named her. She did not rise because a stronger man stood beside her or because the politics arranged themselves in her favor or because fate, in some grand and sentimental gesture, decided she had suffered enough and handed her a victory. She rose because she walked out of a gilded hall with nothing but her own heartbeat and her child's, and she chose, in every moment that followed, every cold room, every dark road, every hunter, every threat, every document designed to erase her, she chose not to become what they needed her to be. Small. Manageable.
Gone.
And her child, that child will be born into a world that is not perfect. The council will resist and rebuild, and the Northern Alliance will regroup, and the road ahead will ask more of her than one night in a stone circle.
She knows that.
But that child will be born free. Not as a bloodline asset. Not as a political variable. Not as the property of frightened men who confused power with control and control with safety.
Free.
She was pregnant. She was rejected. She walked through the fire of both, and she did not ask permission to survive it. She was never just a Luna. She was never just a mate. She was never just a half-blood, a discarded wife, a closed chapter, a low-value variable, a woman someone else got to define. She was Seraphina Cross. And she was only just beginning. The end.